All right, we have a great group here. Thank you for coming together this morning. Hopefully you got a little bit of groove on as you were listening to the music. My name is Lacey Rock, and I'm the Sustainability Director at California State University, Monterey Bay. And I, with the support of many others, will be guiding you through the event today. First, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items. There is a link in the chat, or there will be shortly, that will bring you to a folder with resources that you can access during or after the event. This also went out in email, and the link will also have guides to the questions that we'll be discussing in the breakout sessions later. As you know, everyone was muted and video turned off when joining. We'll ask speakers to unmute themselves and to show video while they're speaking. And when we get into the breakout rooms, please do turn your speakers and cameras back on to make the group conversations just that much more engaging. If you have any technical problems or you need to communicate with the host, please feel free to private message any of the hosts or co-hosts during the event, and we'll help you work it out. We have a wonderful group with us today. We had over 100 RSVPs, and I know people will be continuing to join us today to come together to discuss education and climate change. It's a really wonderful thing to have happen. We are representing business and nonprofit community organizations, school districts and K-12 schools, higher education institutions, local governments, including mayors and council members, and of course, students. And we welcome all of you. I would also like to thank the partners that supported the development of this event: Green Power, California State University, Monterey Bay, the Central Coast Climate Collaborative, and the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. In addition, thank you to all the facilitators that will be guiding us through the breakout sessions. You were all very flexible and supportive as we went through the process of shifting an in-person event to an online event, and we're grateful for your contribution and help. This session is the first of a three-part series of online events that will bring together people in support of finding just and equitable solutions to the challenges and the opportunities presented by climate change. The other sessions will similarly bring people together for in-depth conversations and discussions on the topics of business and policy. And we'll talk more about those at the end of the meeting. Today, however, our event will go in-depth into the field of education. This includes K-12, community education, higher education, as well as various specific fields of study, some that are more traditionally inclined to address climate change and others that are not. And it's through this connection and exploration, we hope you'll all leave with a better understanding of how a variety of educational levels and fields can, and indeed should, be integrating climate change into the learning experience. Our agenda today will kick off with Dr. Ochoa introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Tim Carter, who's president of Second Nature. He will speak on education and the influence of policy within the context of climate change. And after his remarks, we will divide into the breakout rooms. You'll have 20 minutes for breakout meetings at rooms before we come back together as a group. And then following the share back and the key takeaways, Ben Eichart will be providing closing remarks. It'll be a great day, and I'm really excited to have everybody here with us. And with that, I will turn it over ahead of schedule to Dr. Ochoa, who as president of CSUMB also serves as chair of the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. And 4 years ago, he reaffirmed the campus's commitment to achieving carbon neutrality by 2030 when he signed the Second Nature Climate Commitment, which in addition to the carbon neutrality goal, integrates climate change into curriculum and research, and also sets commitments for adaptation and resiliency. Thank you, Dr. Ochoa, for the multiple ways in which you are providing leadership and for being with us today to introduce Dr. Tim Carter.
Oh, thank you, Lacey. And it's wonderful to be here. And I think it's great that we're doing this event and focusing on climate change. Obviously, the pandemic is in everybody's mind right now. And I can't help but think that the way that this pandemic is driving home the fact that we are living in an interconnected world also has lessons to learn when it comes to the impact of climate change on all of humanity and on our planet, the only home that we have. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Tim Carter. Tim Carter is the president of Second Nature, a national nonprofit with a mission to accelerate climate action in and through higher education. As president, Dr. Carter provides strategic leadership for the organization, including a focus on decarbonization activity and climate leadership of the 400 plus schools in Second Nature's Climate Leadership Network and University Climate Change Coalition. The launch of climate resilience, carbon pricing, and large-scale renewable energy initiatives, advocating for climate policy at the state and federal levels, and cross-sector climate activity through the We Are Still In campaign. Prior to Second Nature, Dr. Carter was the founding director of Butler University's Center for Urban Ecology, which he built into a thriving academic center with over $3 million in externally funded initiatives. Dr. Carter received his PhD in ecology with distinction from the Odum School of Ecology at the University of Georgia, and completed his BS in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with his wife Katie and 3 children, and is an avid coffee home roaster. Dr. Carter. I think we need to unmute Dr. Carter.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Dr. Ochoa, thanks for the introduction. All those things are in fact true, especially the home roasting. And I will say that once you go home roasting of coffee, you never go back. The other thing I will say is that this woman behind me, everyone tends to look at her, and there's nothing significant other than the fact that she will continue to judge everyone's conversation from now until the end of this presentation. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'll dive right into this. Really grateful for the invitation to be here and be with everybody, and I look forward to hopefully having some good conversation afterwards in the breakout sessions. All right. So I was tasked kind of with a little bit of an interesting challenge here, and that is to think about the relationship between education, climate, and policy. And it's a place that we live in the higher education space very actively, and have, especially since I've been here the past few years. And as Dr. Ochoa said, obviously it's a very active area of engagement now, given how we respond to COVID is largely a question of policy and the role of higher education playing a role in influencing either directly or indirectly the policies that will come forward. I think what we're used to thinking about is how maybe educational policy works, or we're used to thinking about how climate policy works, or we're thinking about how climate education works. And what I'd like to do is try to shape all 3 of those things. Many of you might be experts in one of those fields, and I think that can be a limiting factor in what we think might be possible for climate solutions, especially. So that CEP triangle, I'd like to just walk through, just to give some food for thought, kind of the why, the what, and the how. And let's just start with the why. As many of you know, the climate crisis, like in some ways the COVID crisis, is one that is existential, and it in fact is increasing in its severity the longer we don't do anything about it. And that's what this is showing here. This the curve that many people talk about has to be, for climate at least, talk about COVID's curve being flattened. We're actually talking about bending the climate curve. So what we have to do is eliminate our emissions down to 0. Net emissions need to get to 0 by 2050. That's what the science tells us if we want to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. To do that, the longer we wait, the steeper the bending of that curve has to be, until you get to a point which it really is very difficult to decarbonize that quickly. Almost all the models will show that about in 10 years, we have to be about at 50% decarbonization. What's worth thinking about there is that not everybody should be at 50%. Those of us who can reduce further and faster should do so, because some, globally especially, some countries and parts of the world cannot do that. The fact that Monterey Bay has a 2030 carbon neutrality goal is actually consistent with what is needed. The people who can take highest levels of ambition should do so. A second reason why to think about climate education and policy is not just we have to decarbonize quickly, but also almost like, why not? This is a pretty famous slide, cartoon from 2009. And it's basically looking at the co-benefits of taking climate action. We do all these other things. If we take climate action seriously, we'll have cleaner air. And I know some of the pictures that are making the rounds now are of LA, the LA skyline just being completely clean, and things that people haven't seen before. You know, India, people seeing the Himalayas from their backyard when they haven't been able to ever do that. And this can actually be really powerful. So changing cultural perspectives on what is possible, and the role that then education and policy can play in helping drive that is really can be inspiring for people. So there's a kind of a why not piece to it. Lastly, I would say, especially those of us in the education field, the next generation, the future generation, whether it's in K-12 or even higher education students, are really asking about this. What are we doing to help solve the global challenges of the world? And maybe in crass terms, but if you think of them as our primary clients, if we're not serving them well as educational institutions, we're doing something wrong. And so we have to be reflective of what the students, the next generation, are telling us they want to see happen, and they want us to do as institutional leaders. So that kind of sets the stage for the why. You know, we need to engage all the levers we can on climate change if we want to accomplish the goals that science tells us we need to do. The what is maybe a little more straightforward in a sense, especially at the high level. For decarbonization to happen, you basically have to do three things. We have to eliminate carbon in our supply, in our electricity supply, to decarbonize that. We have to decarbonize our end uses, and that is, we have to electrify our vehicles, our buildings, and our industries, and really do that both through technology change and then just use less energy specifically in those end uses. So we have to radically increase our energy efficiency. And then lastly, and maybe something that doesn't get as much play for operational folks is the ability to enhance our ecosystems. And this shows incredible potential, especially with soil carbon sequestration on managed lands. But it's a critical part of the equation, the enhancing ecosystems, and one that I know a lot of people in natural lands working groups are thinking about how to do this even in a net positive way, rather than just not converting land to that increases emissions. Even if we do these three things, all the plans that we've seen typically have some level of negative emission technologies at the city or country scale, and that means direct carbon sequestration out of the atmosphere. So these are at a basic level the things we need to do on the climate side. There's also things we need to do on the policy side, and things that are happening right now. And I just want to mention a few of those. One is at the federal level. Carbon pricing is one of the policies that many economists say is the most efficient and effective way to reduce emissions, is to put a price on those emissions. And there's various bills that have been floated around throughout the years. Very difficult to get anything done in Congress in a bipartisan way, but carbon pricing has had a number of them been introduced. The number one action we can take, according to Project Drawdown, is to manage our refrigerants and eliminate hydrofluorocarbons from refrigerant use. And there is actually an act in Congress to do that. Originally, this was through an amendment to the Montreal Protocol called the Kigali Amendment. but the Trump administration did not want to act upon that, and so there has been some federal legislation to move forward with this. Manufacturing is actually behind this because they've already converted to low or no HFC air conditioning units. And then, of course, there's various tax credits that have been in place, and these need to be either ratcheted up or renewed, and various forms of that. The innovation tax credit is one that typically does get renewed most years. Specific to education, though, and climate, I think two areas come to mind at the federal level. One is through appropriations. Obviously, climate science gets funding through National Science Foundation or DOE, and clean energy R&D. This happens on a regular basis, and a lot of higher ed institutions take advantage of that. And it's a really important way to continue our new knowledge creation. One that might be less familiar to folks is the Higher Education Act. About 10 years ago, we actually introduced a piece of a program into that act called the University Sustainability Program that did get authorized and for 1 year was appropriated. So we got some funding for 1 year for the USP. And that actually helps campuses, higher education institutions, execute on their sustainability commitments, specifically can be applied to climate action on campuses. And so in this most recent reauthorization process of the Higher Ed Act, we introduced a few ways to get this program reauthorized, and one of which was to do a new standalone piece of legislation called the Higher Ed Sustainability Act, which was we did in partnership with Senator Whitehouse's office. And so this actually focuses explicitly on resilience and climate action as part of higher education, and provides funding for that through the Higher Ed Act. And that's probably a lesser known piece of legislation. We also work at the, Second Nature does at the state level with some partners, and have had some successes around various policies in these different states in recent months. I think it's worth saying and worth mentioning and acknowledging how important the Recovery Act process is, and how important policy engagement for climate is on in this time of COVID. In 2009, you may not know this, you may know this, the Recovery Act coming out of the financial crisis then was the largest investment of clean energy in U.S. history. And there is a potential to go in different paths here with the next version of the CARES Act, or whatever we might call it, not the most recent one, but the next version of it. If we invest in infrastructure that is relying even more on carbon, or locks us into longer term commitments to carbon activity, it's going to be much more difficult to find that shift happening per those curves we noticed earlier. And there's a really interesting paper just came out a couple of days ago looking at this at the global scale. And the authors basically conclude that this is the moment, if we want to have serious and impactful global legislation at the country scales they're working on this. Now is the time to really be actively advocating for a recovery package that helps and assists and accelerates mitigation of the climate impacts. So then we're left with, what is the role of, so we kind of like touched on climate solutions, what are the solutions, what are the policies, and then what is education's role? And I'll specifically look at higher education. But I thought this image is interesting from Monterey Bay. You know, it's kind of almost like this divine right to exist, you know, that the university is portraying here. And it's beautiful, of course, but it can also lead to a false sense of you know, the ivory tower phenomenon, that we produce and create and sustain knowledge for its own sake. And there's valid reasons to think that way. But if we're not thinking about the role that education plays in helping society and global communities solve the challenges that they face, it just puts you at risk at losing a lot of the relevance that you may want to have, and doesn't address maybe the concerns that your students have that are participating in your institutions. So we talk about this in two ways. The role of education in accelerating climate action through policy, maybe in particular, but in a general sense, is both as an institutional actor and as an enabler of action. And the reason why it's important to hold those two together is that oftentimes you find yourself, or you may find yourself, in one of these buckets or the other. You may be working in your campus operations and you're tasked with figuring out how to install the solar panels on campus or reduce energy use. But then you may never engage with the faculty or the academics who are studying those same solar panels, or helping students understand what the policy context is around why people would have economic reasons to install those things. And so that disconnect between institutional action and those who are helping with those institutional actions and the enabling actions, which is really the knowledge creation and transfer, can really cause a problem in thinking about the integrated and whole mobilization role of higher education. So this is higher education specifically. And I think what we like to do, and like to think about for the last few minutes here, is how is the role of actor and enabler a way in which we can engage in the policy discourse and potentially help with solutions through the full mobilization of our institutions, and not just one piece or the other piece. And so I think there's a how. So when we think about the how for higher education, at least, I think there's four kind of main ways this can happen. And again, linking in the educational mission, the importance of the large impact that universities have in their own carbon emissions, as well as the academic side of the house. And I'll just walk through these in a little more detail in a second. But knowledge creation and transfer, especially using a demand-driven approach, not just for its own sake. Secondarily, the institutional clout that universities have. Third is the mobilization of students and activation of student interest. And last is modeling some policies. One of the things that we all know about at least higher education is that higher ed, typically there are silos across the board, and it's very difficult to understand what is happening in other departments, let alone other universities. And so one of the things that it's important to start with when we're thinking about how to mobilize climate action, the whole of the university, is to understand what the assets are there. One of the things we've done with our University Climate Change Coalition is actually map those assets so that both internally people can understand what could be mobilized, as well as externally what partners could understand what that mobilization is. And there are examples of how that then can translate into some research activity. You may be familiar with the Grand Challenge initiative at UCLA, which is based on a partnership with the city, where the city has some goals, and LA said, well, how do we, or UCLA said, how do we actually rethink our research questions to help the city meet those goals? So from a knowledge transfer perspective, are we doing our research for its own sake, or can we help the city accomplish its goals in a way that wouldn't happen otherwise? And this has been a pretty successful example of how research is applied. We're based in Boston. Here in Boston, the Boston University has led a carbon-free Boston initiative, which is essentially the same thing. How does the city of Boston's climate action plan get implemented through the assets of the research universities that are there? Second, I think, so that's on the research side of knowledge creation. When you think about knowledge transfer, then oftentimes we're thinking about curriculum or co-curricular activities. And we're a big fan of this EPIC model, which is, it's an acronym, I think it stands for Educational Partnership Innovation for Communities, something like that. Monterey Bay actually has, CSU has an EPIC program there, and I don't know if Dan's on the call or not, but the idea here is that you have your curricular base, and instead of that asking the curricular base to incorporate some climate module as part of it, or teach climate courses instead of teaching your economics course, what you do is actually keep teaching that the same way, but apply those topics, the basic Econ 101 or urban planning or architecture, apply them to a need that your community is asking for. And so now your students can actually work on something that has real world implications, and yet they learn the same theory, the same content that you would want to teach anyway as a faculty member. And so there is some infrastructure that goes along with this model that you need to create, but it can result in some really impactful products that aren't just textbook examples, but they're actually real world examples that result from that student learning. So this is just a case of a Minnesota community that had their greenhouse gas reduction plan, essentially a climate action plan created from a class based at the University of Minnesota. A second piece here is the idea of anchor institutions having weight. And the higher education is one of those anchor institutions. Oftentimes, you're the largest employer in your communities, definitely have a huge institutional footprint and legacy, and that matters politically and policy-wise. And so our theory of change is that presidents' commitments actually do make a difference, and in fact, they do. We see that. And in fact, when you sit down with your elected official as a senior leader, you can say, you know, this is an express commitment of ours. That's why this policy needs to be tweaked or changed or modified around climate action, you know, whether it's energy efficiency or a renewable energy standard. That resonates with folks, especially at the local level. One of the ways that can be done even at a larger scale, we know that presidents can be sensitive to the political context they find themselves in. And so we've brought together other sectors that also share these goals. And in this case, you can see here, this is a letter that we sent to the House leadership around House Bill 9, which was the Climate Action Now Act. And it was signed on to by members of the faith community, members of healthcare. We had higher ed leadership. We had cultural institutions. We had mayors, indigenous communities. We had businesses, and all together, by leveraging all of their voices, it takes the kind of the political exposure off of single sectors or single individuals that lead higher ed institutions. So this kind of cross-sector advocacy can be a really critical role that higher ed plays, mainly because it's not expected. People don't expect President Ochoa to show up and say, climate action is really important for my institution, and here's why that clean energy policy makes a lot of sense. They expect the green roofs to do it. They expect the renewable energy companies to do it, but they don't expect higher ed to do it. And yet higher ed does have that need. And so it can be really powerful. And I'll move through these last quickly. I know we're running out of time here. So in terms of students, we're all familiar with the impact students can have on campus. And many of you may have seen the climate protest that actually happened during the Harvard-Yale football game. Seems like a lifetime ago that we were having football games. But they protested on campus and brought national attention to the issue. And not just to mobilize their own institutions, but actually for all of the world to see that this is important to students. And this voice, this ability for students to speak into issues is really a powerful thing, and can be a powerful cultural move wherever campuses are located. And they can themselves bring their own energy to advocate and register people to vote and be part of the policy making process. Last thing I'll mention before I close is just the idea that policies can be modeled on higher ed campuses that could inform what those policies could look like, climate policies in the future. So we have I mentioned carbon pricing earlier. We have a toolkit for establishing an internal carbon price on your campus. And what that can do is help you test different versions of that then you may see reflected either at your state or ultimately potentially at the federal level. And then the impact of those. We have obviously education, we could study how well or not well those work towards accomplishing those policy goals. So those are kind of 4 areas, hopefully seed some ideas for you. And before we do the breakout session, I was just going to say, we do have a monthly policy update that we send around to all of our schools. And if you're interested in signing up for that, either just contact me directly, let me know, or just go to the website here and you can register for it. I look forward to our conversation later. And Lacey, I think I'm going to get out of this and turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate your comments and your insights. Great job connecting education, policy, and climate, sort of the why and the how. Making those connections can really make a difference. You have set us up well for the conversations that we'll be doing in our breakout rooms next. So I'm happy you'll be sticking around and joining us in the higher ed breakout group. All right, and we are going to dig into some conversations now. I'm going to go through just a few sort of technical pieces as we get into the breakout rooms. You have been pre-assigned to the breakout rooms based on your responses in the RSVP form that you submitted. However, what we noticed is that if you're using an email to connect to Zoom that's different than the email you use to RSVP, we'll need to manually assign you to a room. If you're put into a breakout room that doesn't match what you put on the RSVP, we apologize, but very much appreciate if you go with the flow as much as possible. The technical pieces for facilitating this session has been a learning experience for all of us involved, and I know we're all sort of increasing our capacity for technology learning during this shelter in place. So bear with us. And what you'll see on your screen is just a little pop-up box that you'll click on that says you can join a breakout room, join now or later. You can click join now and it'll just automatically bring you into the breakout room. You'll be given a 5-minute warning towards the end of the session. And then when the host closes the meeting, you'll have 1 minute sort of counting down to wrap up your sessions. And then a pop-up box will come up to say, return to the main session or leave. You want to return to the main session, otherwise Zoom will just kick you off and you'll have to come back in and click again. There are, hopefully many of you had a chance to look at the folders and resources. Those are up and you can use those during the session. You'll also be able to access your questionnaires and your facilitators will help walk you through the questions before we come back. So those are most of the technical notes before we break up, but one important note just on context. I want to encourage you all to remember the aspect of the original vision that we shared during the introduction for the event that referenced justice and equity in the context of climate change. And while this is an important, critical environmental issue, it's also very much an issue of equity and social justice. So really, please be cognizant of that. And both aspects really should be addressed in our conversations. And they should be addressed by all of us as we address climate change, sort of in the big we, as well as the we of the group that we're all in right now. Let's share. So I hope everybody had a real engaging conversation. We're gonna have some reports back from the different groups. And we're just gonna go right down the line here. So Roberta, if you wanna kick us off with just highlighting 1 or 2 key things that your group discussed, that would be great.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Lacey. We had a very productive discussion in the business and economics breakout room. And one of the key points that we discussed was how businesses create externalities. An example of it is pollution, and how the environmental impact of these externalities must be taken into account, both in the cost of goods and services, and also how do we internalize, how do the business can internalize those externalities they produce. Some of the ways that we discussed include, for example, a carbon tax or cap and trade mechanisms, or on the other side, it could be to have incentives for businesses to, instead of regulations, to reduce those externalities. For example, we talked about tax breaks or other incentives that can be financial or not, for the purpose of reducing waste and pollutions at the individual company level. Other key points include the role of education in changing the practices of businesses from a consumer side. So having consumers to push businesses to change the products and the services they offer. So it could be the change come from the consumer side, directly from the demand side. And another thing that we talked about, a challenge specifically, is how it is difficult for businesses to think today. So currently think about future costs and future impacts of climate change on their business in the future. So when they're making decisions today and investments today, it's difficult for them to know what decisions they can make today considering the impacts on climate change. And another thing on the positive side that we talked about is how businesses can partner with other businesses locally to share good practices. So collaborating and sharing among businesses. So these were the main discussion points.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Roberta, and the Business and Economics Group. We'll turn it over next to the Social Science and Humanities. Dan, go ahead.
All right, can you hear me?
I can.
Great. So we had a wonderful conversation. There were about 9 of us in the group. And I think that the key word that often came up around one of the greatest challenge within this field of study, or probably any field of study, is the issue of siloing, which often happens in higher education. It's a common topic in academic circles about how we silo into various disciplines. But in the conversations that ensued, I realized that siloing can take other forms as well. And it's not only within higher education or within disciplines. You can have siloing between the people maybe who have one set of beliefs and another set of people with different sets of beliefs. You can have siloing you can think of social justice as a type of siloing in and of itself, the people who haves and the people who don't. So I think the word of siloing kept coming up, and that the humanities and the social sciences really work towards breaking that down. They're really trying to look across many different disciplines. The topic of history came up, looking at what are the mistakes we've made in the past and how can we try to avoid repeating similar mistakes in the future. And again, that's part of humanities. And looking at partnerships between higher education institutions, whether it's universities like CSUMB and the community colleges, can also help break down another type of siloing that takes place there. Tendency, of course, is to just focus on technical skills. What else can they focus on that, maybe every course should have sustainability related outcomes in it. Maybe that should be part of every higher education institution's ethos of what they're going to be teaching their students.
Perfect.
Let's see.
That's good, actually. That's perfect.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dan, and all that participated in that breakout session. Next, I'll turn it over to Ashley, who will talk about health and well-being.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And particularly, thank you to our participants in the Health and Wellbeing breakout room for their insight and input. So as you all know, from exposure to extreme weather and heat waves, to worsening air pollution and the spread of zoonotic diseases, the coronavirus pandemic being one of them, it's become very clear to us that climate change is a health emergency. And so the importance of integrating the connections between climate change and health into our educational communities is absolutely critical, particularly now more than ever. And so while we chose specifically not to sort of, again, pontificate the science behind the linkages between the two, for the sake of time, we encourage all of you to explore our resource folder in the Drive and to add to it as well. To basically summarize our key points, we had a good group of about 9 of us in this breakout room, students from CSUMB. We got Sam representing Gravity Water, Nancy representing Renegación, and students. And we basically realize that a lot of this really needs to come from the bottom up, and so student and staff mobilization is definitely key. Some of the goals that we have outlined were things like helping students and staff connect the dots between climate and health through curricula and co-curricular activities from a personal, community, and global perspective through immersive and experiential learning, really empowering academic institutions to utilize science and culture-based research and knowledge to advocate for climate and health-related policies at the school in addition to the municipal levels. Also, using this as a way to for students to encourage educating their family and communities about the benefits of purchasing locally and in-season produce, for example, and supporting and learning about their local farmers. Also building just youth empowerment and intercultural competency as a way for students to complement their studies with tangible progress towards something they're super passionate about. Renegación has a great heat stress awareness and prevention campaign that they're hoping to do more outreach into our educational systems, and also to foster greater collaboration and connection between schools, school districts, our health departments, our COEs, our businesses, and neighbors. Some of the challenges that we talked about were obviously capacity and resource limitations, the time it takes to communicate the issues, the knowledge, and actually creating, project-based learning is very difficult and time-consuming for our teachers who are already tasked with so much. School standards don't quickly adapt to changing circumstances, and of course, just general environmental barriers. Some of the intersectoral collaboration ideas that we came up with were things like collaborating with our agriculture agencies and local food policy councils and schools to support community and school gardens, to promote food waste reduction, also collaborating with our transportation and planning, parks and recreation agencies, and to implement more safe active transportation, especially for children and youth, things like safe routes to school, complete streets, things like that. Let's see, also, Renovación also has a Healthy You for a Healthy Planet brochure that outlines the benefits of plant-rich diets that they're hoping to, integrate more into the classroom. In addition,
Ashley, that's awesome.
there's a lot. We just
awesome. You guys have so much stuff.
Yeah.
Wow.
take a look
Great,
at that document.
great content. Yeah. We're all of that, it sounds like, is in the folder. So please, for those of you that's triggered an interest in, take a look at the folder. And thank you to your group and to facilitating, Ashley. We'll turn it over to Beth next to talk about K-12.
Well, thank you very much to not only the people in our K-12 group. We had some really exciting conversations, but for the other facilitators, thank you for summarizing. It's a difficult job to summarize all that happens in those breakout rooms, so that was exciting to hear. A couple of big points, one specifically related to equity. As Lacey mentioned to kick it off, that while there are climate change standards, standards are not implemented equally across the curricula and across school or even within a district. So we had some conversation about the necessity of empowering teachers to bring that climate science to their students in a more equitable way. And then there is another piece that one of the things we talked a lot about, what are successful models or strategies or things that we have seen work. And it came back to repeatedly this idea of project-based, hands-on, outdoor learning. And it reminded me of what Tim kicked us off with, right? This idea of this integration, interdisciplinary integration, and community-based learning. So you teach a course that's applied to a need in the community. And we talked a lot about that and how there are some projects that students are working on. It is a challenge for educators to integrate projects, but I think it's the way education K-12 is going more and more with the new science and engineering standards. So getting students outdoors and doing what scientists and engineers do, right? Make some observations, collect data, present that data, see what they can do to affect what's happening in their community in positive ways, and then measure the results of their action, right? And sharing that with others. Project-based summits and places where students come together. This is just occurring to me now. We did a climate summit for K-12 at the aquarium, and students saw not only the impact their project had, but they saw the variety of projects. There are all these ways to address climate issues, and that was really powerful for them. But a number of people in our breakout room talked about the engagement that results in by having students engaged in a community issue and having places to apply their learning. One benefit of that is that we develop learners who apply what they learn, not merely regurgitate information. Therefore, they're much better critical thinkers when they come of age to vote. We talked about that it's not just about the science, but it's about health education, social studies and history. There are lots of ways to bring climate change education into the classroom and make it accessible and more holistic for students. I think that those are the key ideas. We had, as I said, a lot of conversation and a lot of great ideas. And we have some resources. I added a couple others that came up as a result of the conversation. There's a PowerPoint or Google Slides in the folder there with links and some primary literature resources around education and climate change, and age-appropriate conservation messaging, all kinds of things in there. So feel free to dive into any of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Beth, and to the K-12 group. I think there's so much that we've talked about with our keynote speaker and throughout the day that has, seemed more focused on higher ed, but I think all of that is really applied to the K-12 field as well. So next we'll have Tiffany presenting for the physical and biological sciences.
Yes, hi, thank you. Good morning. So we were very pleased to have 2 students and 3 current or former academically affiliated people in our group. So really the highlights are, and a lot has been articulated already. I have to say that, a lot of what we came up with us really span those 4 areas that our keynote talked about: knowledge creation and transfer, anchor institutional clout, student mobilization, and modeling policies. But the highlights, in terms of challenges, public assumes they already understand climate science and the physical and biological sciences, and we need to make sure that we have engaging ways for them to actually connect to that. Secondly, funding, especially graduate research, is not necessarily sufficient. Particularly as a lot of funding that would typically go to physical and biological sciences are going to climate unfriendly solutions. So not necessarily at the climate nexus, the climate supportive nexus. There's also the ivory tower problem, kind of the siloing that was already discussed, that disconnect between academic research, societal needs, and real world applications. From a student perspective and a researcher perspective, occasionally when you're in depth in your field of study in biological and physical sciences, sometimes you lose sight of the importance of climate change. And in physical and biological sciences, it's very hard to connect and integrate environmental justice. We also, successful examples, clearly academia develops much of the research around climate impacts that are utilized by local, state governments and nonprofits. For example, the California Fourth Climate Change Assessment, Healthy Soils regional collaboration, multi-sectoral collaboration. And then finally, unique ways directly provide evidence research for policymakers and managers. Work with youth to engage them in climate science, to provide opportunities for them to get hooked into it as a potential career pathway, and work to bridge the gap between science and policymakers. And then the last thing I'll mention is, a lot of what we talked about, I think a bridge to that collaboration could be through the recent tool that was launched through Central Coast Climate Collaborative and Adrian Grieve at Cal Poly SLO. I think I put that into the chat box in I think it came over from our breakout room. So a way to connect scientists and local governments for this very thing. So thank you.
Yep, that's also in the resources as well. So when you access that folder, there's a sheet that has a lot of links in it. So please do check that out.
Thank you.
I'll be updating and providing feedback for the higher education group. We also had a mix. We had some faculty and instructors, and we also had some sort of staff practitioners from higher ed institutions. And one of the or some of the challenges that we noted was sort of apathy. This 2 sides of a coin, right? Maybe some real apathetic, unaware students, and others of sort of over-optimism and almost a sense of naivety with the scope of how to respond to the challenges that may be coming up in the organizations that they then go and work in. and some of the ways that we talked about addressing it, oh, sorry, one of the other challenges was just seeing climate change as a political issue, and the challenges that then come along with that. And some of the ways that we had talked about addressing it was to first connect with other aspects of climate change, sort of thinking back to the comic that our keynote presenter shared to help depoliticize and make it not necessarily about climate change, but about all of the other positive things that come when we address climate change. And then for engagement, really thinking about how to support students in voting and civic engagement, and uniquely within higher ed is really getting the subject matter experts to talk about an issue without making it a political issue. So those were a few of the aspects that we discussed in our group. And I'll turn it over finally to Enid to fill us in on the communications, community, and arts.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So our group was full of amazing communicators, of course. So I'm actually going to turn it over there. There's 3 of them. They're each going to tell you one brief point to wrap up because it's a diverse group with really great points and I want to get out of their way. So first will be Corin.
We shared that there's power in the voice of youth and creation and storytelling, and that's an incredible agent for change in our conversations.
And next will be Kirsten.
Good morning, I'm Kirsten Liskey with Ecology Action, and we talked about how it's been great that there's been a move off just individual responsibility toward corporate responsibility, but here in COVID, we're both seeing the power of just individual choices. The companies haven't changed, but our air is a lot cleaner, our water's a lot cleaner, we're a lot more connected. Additionally, these kind of complex concepts like flattening the curve are now pretty commonplace, and we can leverage that as we move forward with our climate communications.
And last, Claudia.
And then we wrapped it up saying that community has a big role in ensuring that everything that is happening right now, the way that individuals are supporting local businesses, local ag, making these decisions to be self-sufficient, which is definitely towards climate action by composting and growing their own foods. You know, community engagement is going to be key to keep these behaviors active post-COVID. So that's up to, you know, community serving organizations, chambers of commerce, higher education, to instill those values into our community as a whole to make this all a more holistic opportunity for climate change and climate action.
And so for us as communicators and artists, we're looking at ways to use that visual vernacular, songs, moving images to help tell those science stories and engage in others telling their science stories. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Enid, and all the other folks that contributed to that last wrap up. You guys, this was great. We just put what was originally like a 3 to 4 hour in-person event into basically a 30-minute Zoom breakout. There's so much more discussion that could be had, and I know that, you know, we're just scratching the surface. And I think one of the really great things that I'm taking away from this is just, no matter what field you're in, no matter where you're coming from this, there's it's something that's connecting all of us. And so I look forward to continuing to have these conversations and to move forward together. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to turn it over to Ben Eichart to provide some closing remarks. Thank you all. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Lacey. Really want to thank all of you for joining us today for this first session of our Central Coast Climate Summit series. I think some quick appreciation is in order. First off, I would like to thank Dr. Ochoa and everyone at CSUMB for convening today's summit. I want to thank our other partners, the Central Coast Climate Collaborative, Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, as well as the tireless staff that I get to work with at Green Power and our parent organization, the Romero Institute, especially Leslie Austin, who did a lot of work for today's summit. I also want to send a big thanks to our breakout room facilitators. You know, as Lacey said, we had initially planned an in-person summit for today, but after our region's shelter-in-place order went into effect, we debated whether we should try to adapt it for this current reality. And I have to say, I'm extremely grateful to Lacey at CSUMB. She brought the energy and the initiative and pushed us all to do this. So thank you so much, Lacey. I think that in this, you know, the reality that we're facing today, we have some important questions that need to be answered. Can we interact while still being physically distant? Can we still share ideas that spark new ways of acting? Can we still make connections that open doors of possibility? Can we address the big challenges like climate change? Can we, as the communities of the Monterey Bay Area and Central Coast, still work together to make our region the leader in California for sustainability, economic prosperity, and environmental justice? I know that all of us who organized today's summit are determined to answer those questions with a resounding yes. And I thank you for being part of this experiment and for being a part of building that answer. A little bit about follow-up. We'll be sending you information, including a link to an evaluation form, which we would appreciate if you fill out, a link to get Second Nature policy updates, a link to the attendee resource folder, and lastly, we'll be sending some information about our subsequent sessions in the fall and winter, which will dig more deeply into the realms of public policy and business. And so with that, I want to thank you all very much for joining us today, and we wish you all well.